These are not my slides. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Poor Braden. You're doing a good job back there. Just giving you a hard time. We know what week this was. It was tax deadline. That's something that, I think was brought up. I think Zach made that comment last week at the Lord's table about, it's April 15th, and, that's a date that we all remember for something very specific. I didn't want that reminder, but, it comes every year, and it's the tax deadline. That happened this past Tuesday because it fell on a Saturday, the 15th, and then there was some sort of holiday that I guess only government employees got on Monday or something like that, and so it was pushed to Tuesday, so the 17th was this year's deadline, and the time to file your tax return and get all the paperwork squared away, and if you owe, to pay the money and that you owe and things like that. Taxes have always been kind of a contentious issue. They were in the days of Jesus, as we're going to see, and as we just had read for us in Matthew chapter 22, it was one of those hot-button questions that they tried to trap Jesus in. Well, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? If he said yes, they could trap him there. If he said no, they would say, well, you're rebelling against the king. And if he said yes, they would say, well, you're not a very good Jew because Rome is a foreign governor, and how could you support paying a foreign government? So they tried to get him to say yes or no, and either way, they'd kind of have this gotcha kind of thing. But his answer was pure brilliance, as it always was. So they were certainly a contentious issue back then, and today, every election cycle, every time politicians are running for office, whether on a statewide or especially in presidential elections, I know taxes was a big issue with George H.W. Bush and his campaign for re-election. I know his promise for no new taxes and things like that came back to get him, and people turned that on him. And there's always promises from politicians that I'll lower taxes, or I'll do this, or we'll raise taxes on the rich. Some people think that's a great idea, other people think that's wrong, and so it's always one of those issues that people have debated, people have had mixed feelings about, or strong feelings about. And it certainly was something that they asked Jesus about to try and catch him in these traps. The great answer, I've got Mark 12, but it was also in Matthew 22. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. That's going to be our basic theme this morning. We're going to start by talking a little bit about what Jesus and the Bible has to say about taxes, but that's my purpose this morning isn't to persuade you that paying taxes on time is necessarily a good thing, but I think it's a Christian responsibility. I'll say that much. But what I want to do is draw our attention to the parallel that Jesus is making here. That in Jesus' mind, this was pretty black and white to him. This was a trick question, but his answer was just, like I said, pure brilliance. And it's just so matter-of-fact and straightforward to him. Whose picture is on it? It's his. What's the big deal? He said, I'm not supporting the Roman government. And one thought there is the people that Jesus was asking, he said, show me a coin. Some people believe that this was because, Roman currency wasn't in large circulation, but likely the people like the Herodians and the Pharisees and the religious leadership that was benefiting from Roman occupation, they were likely the ones to have this currency. That's why Jesus didn't pull one out of his pocket. For one, we know Jesus was probably a poor man. But for two, it's very likely that really only the people that were, in Rome's pocket would have this currency on them. But it's a simple matter to him. He says, render to Caesar, give to him what belongs to him, give to God what belongs to him. So there's a parallel there with paying the tax that was due to a worldly leader, and there's a parallel to giving to God what is owed to him. There's some distinctions and differences too, but I want to work with this comparison this morning. Now, Jesus did have plenty to say about taxes. One thing I do want to point out, though, in Matthew chapter 22, if you're still over there, you kind of skim over this text in Matthew chapter 22, it's clear that this was not a genuine question. They weren't coming to Jesus because they were struggling with this question. It was keeping them up at night. What's the answer to this? How do we reconcile this? What should we do? They weren't really asking his advice. It's kind of like when people come to you and ask, how could God kill so many people in the flood? They're probably not actually wrestling with this and looking for an answer. They're probably just looking for you to say something that they can turn against you. And that's what's going on in Matthew 22 with Jesus. They aren't really looking for an answer, just trying to trap him. The Pharisees went and counseled together how they might trap him in what he said. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. So we know it's a particular group of people that is not looking for wisdom from Jesus. And they're trying to trap him. And there's something specific about this question as well. Should we pay tax to Caesar? They're not asking, are taxes okay? Should we pay taxes, like any good citizen? They're talking about paying taxes to Caesar. This is the specific question in Matthew 22. And again, historically, Rome was, an empire that was built on domination, that was built on going to other nations, defeating them and conquering them with their military, and then imposing their government and their rule and authority over these nations and kind of holding on to them as satellite nations, if you will. They would appoint kind of a client king. In the case of Judea, it was the Herods, a king, but they weren't really a sovereign king. They were a king of that region or that land, but they were still subject to the emperor. Or they would appoint Roman governors. We know of Pilate, as in the case of Jesus' execution, his crucifixion. So Rome came in 63 BC. They took control of the Jewish homeland, and they became basically a subject of Rome at that point. And so that's their specific question. It's not just should we pay taxes. I just wanted to point that out as a distinction. Not just should we pay taxes, but should we pay taxes to Caesar? The leader of the known world, the leader of the largest empire. They don't always spend their money wisely. And it's important to note when we look at Romans chapter 13 a little bit later, when Paul says we should be subject to governing authorities, Paul was talking about Rome at a time when Nero was persecuting Christians. So these are absolute rules he's describing here as far as, we can't violate God. That's an absolute rule. We listen to God before we listen to men. But he also says we respect governing authorities. And so even in the case of someone like Caesar, in the particular circumstance where Rome was ruling over them. And this was a very divisive issue. You've got the zealots. We know one of the apostles was known as a zealot. They were a group that was radically and violently opposed to Roman rule. You have tax collectors like Matthew, who was also an apostle. A lot of the common folks in Judea hated the tax collectors because they were doing Rome's dirty work. They were collecting money for Rome, and they hated that. You're taking money from us to give to a foreign power. And so this was the particular nature of the question. And we know Jesus' answer. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But I also want to say Jesus does address normal taxation, if you will. So I just wanted to point out in Matthew 22, that's an extreme example. And even there, Jesus still says, give to Caesar what belongs to him. There's no debate there. I'm not supporting, Rome's government, but the fact that you have his coins, again, the elite of Judea, those who are benefiting from Roman occupation, he says, you take coins from him and you benefit from having them, so they're his to begin with. Just give it back to him. It was a very simple matter to Jesus, but he does address taxation. Matthew chapter 17, if you go back a few questions and you see what I mean here, taxation, this is a different story, a different type of tax, but again, the same idea of testing Jesus, trying to trap him with a question about taxation. So this has always been kind of a contentious issue over the years. Still is today. Matthew chapter 17 and verse 24. And when they had come to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" One thing that I never really noticed until recently is they're asking Peter. They're not asking Jesus, but they're asking about Jesus, but they're not going to him directly. It's kind of underhanded the way they're going about this. They come to one of Jesus' closest friends and say, does your master pay this tax? Peter, it seems like he quickly responds, yes, without even really consulting Jesus about it. But he answers for it. Jesus said, well, sure, he pays that tax, like everybody. And notice in verse 25, it says, when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first. Again, showing that Jesus knew what was going on, even when he wasn't physically present. He knew what was going on everywhere. He knew what was going on in the hearts and minds of people around him, because he was God. He was the creator. And so I just think that's interesting, a neat little detail there, that Jesus spoke to him first. Peter answered the question on his behalf, and then Peter walks in the house, and Jesus immediately starts talking about the tax, because he knew what was going on. Imagine being one of the disciples, and that kept happening, when Jesus would kind of just answer a question that was on your mind. Like, I was thinking that. How did he know to start talking about that? Or he just sit down and start talking about who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And did he hear us arguing about that? Did he even hear us? That must have just been impressive. But notice what Jesus says. What do you think, Simon? Again, Peter just got done answering this question to somebody else in a different place. And the first thing Jesus says, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers? Verse 26, Peter answers from strangers. And so he's basically saying, a prince doesn't pay tax to his own father, the king. They collect a tax from the other people, from the citizens, from strangers, but not from their family. What's the parallel Jesus is making here? The 2 drachma tax, I believe, was related to the temple, which was God's house, so to speak. Jesus is the Son of God. He says, I'm exempt from this tax. I don't have to pay it. So he's almost telling Peter, you kind of misrepresented me there. I'm exempt from this. I don't have to pay it. But Jesus says, but I don't want to upset people right now, so let's just go ahead and pay it. And he says to him, verse 27, but lest we give them offense, I don't have to, but lest we give them offense, go to the sea and throw in a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a stater. Now this represents, 4 drachma, so the equivalent of Peter's tax and Jesus' tax. Take that and give it to them for you and me. So that way Jesus would be paid up. Jesus said, I'm exempt, but Peter wasn't, others weren't, and Jesus still paid it anyway. So I don't want to cause offense. This isn't something that Jesus was violently opposed to, the idea of paying taxes. What a neat little story there, too. I went fishing yesterday, and first of all, I'd love to have caught anything, period, but let alone a fish that had a couple $1,000s in it to, settle up with the government. But that would have been fantastic. I just paid my tax. It would have been nice to find a fish, a couple grand in its mouth. And but there's another example where Jesus talks a little bit about taxes, and then indirectly, of course, this is still, the apostles are representatives of Jesus, and Paul himself said that, my words are the Lord's commandments. So we know their words are authoritative. Go to Romans chapter 13. A little bit of further teaching on this idea. I know some people oppose paying taxes because I don't like the way the government spends my money. They spend it on things I don't approve of, and yeah, they do. But you pay that tax anyway. I'm not saying you have to love it. I'm not saying you have to agree with it. I'm not saying you can't vote and try to get involved in the realm of politics and try and change policy and reduce or eliminate tax if that's your persuasion. But I'm saying when it's the law of the land, it's something we're supposed to do. It's our responsibility. Romans chapter 13, let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. So governments are God ordained. We know that governments fall sometimes, and we know in past times God identified himself as the cause of that. That when governments became so corrupt, when nations became so corrupt, God would take care of them. God doesn't tell us what he's doing today, like he did in the Bible and revealed to us, but This is still a valid point today. They're God-ordained sources of authority. Therefore, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Now, again, there's a lot of things our government does. There's a lot of things that our president does. There's a lot of things that past presidents have done. There's a lot of things that local, state politicians do. There's a lot of things in Congress and whatever that I don't approve of, that I don't like, that I'd like to see changed or different. And that's fine. I can have those opinions. You can have those opinions too. You can disagree with me. But we can't oppose. We can't simply say, well, I don't like what the government's doing. I don't like that law, so I'm just not going to do it. It's a different matter when government tries to pass a law that is in conflict with God's laws. We've got to take God's side on that. But when it's just something I don't like, it says we can't oppose them. We can try to change the system, and thankfully, that's one thing we ought to be thankful for about America. Representative government. I don't know if you have how strong your faith is and how the system works, but it's a system designed to allow us to influence policy. And I'm thankful for that. But he says we shouldn't oppose. Because if we resist authority, I don't like the law, so I'm simply not going to follow it. He says you are opposing the ordinance of God. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. It is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath upon one who practices evil. And I just want to point out again that governments are ordained by God, but they are not perfect. They are not perfect in their execution of justice. This is kind of like the book of Proverbs here. I understand Romans to be like the book of Proverbs, Romans 13. You know, it says, train up a child in the way they should go, and they will not depart. That's not every situation, every circumstance, it will always work. It's just a general rule. Generally, if you give attention to your children and the way you train them, that's going to stick. You know, it says a kind word will diffuse wrath. Generally speaking, that is true. But there are sometimes, no matter how polite you are, someone's just going to blow up and get angry. And, you know, so there's always exceptions. And that's what he's saying is, in general, governments exist to promote justice, to punish evildoers. That's their general authority from God. They aren't perfect at this. There are exceptions. There are times when governments completely fail. But I think the point I always take away from this is, government, good or bad, is usually better than no government. It's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, especially when governments are making laws you don't like, but think about parts of the world, disputed territories where there are no government. Those are the parts of the world I don't want to visit. Those are the parts of the world that are war zones. It's kind of like in the book of Judges when everybody did what was right in their own eyes. That's chaos. That's not good living conditions. So it's just one of those things. My purpose here in this lesson isn't to persuade you that governments are the best thing in the world, but I just want to point out clear biblical teaching here. You don't have to love everything about our government, but let's not just focus on the negative. I think that's what the media likes. Just always focus and nitpick on the negative, bad things. Everything's bad. The government's, doing evil, and we're all going to fall apart, and the country's just going to come down and collapse on itself. And, let's just take a step back and say, yes, there's probably things I don't like. There's laws that I don't care for. There's a lot I don't like about policies and tax, how high the taxes are and things like that. But at the end of the day, let's be thankful that we've got a government that exists and that more or less keeps the balance of punishing crime. Doesn't do a perfect job, but it's better than having nothing. And that's kind of what I take away from this text. Psalm 72 before we move on. So again, my primary purpose here this morning isn't to persuade you that paying your taxes should be a joy, and you should have a smile on your face, and you should never question the government. But I did want to point out clear biblical teaching. God establishes governments. God approves of governments. God says if you resist them, you are opposing his ordinance. They are not perfect, but in general, They make things more peaceful than if there were no governments. Psalm 72, I want to read the first 4 verses. Give the king thy judgments, O God, and thy righteousness to the king's son. May he judge thy people with righteousness and thine afflicted with justice. Let the mountains bring peace to the people and the hills in righteousness. This is talking about the king. This is talking about governments here. Verse 4, may he vindicate the afflicted of the people, save the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. Governments don't do this job perfectly. That's why God says, don't take your own revenge. Vengeance is mine. I will repay. God is admitting that there are going to be some innocent people that maybe suffer. There are going to be some guilty people that maybe aren't punished the way they should in this life. But God says, governments aren't perfect, but I am. My judgment will be complete, final, and perfect when it's all said and done. So just a few of the things Jesus had to say about taxes. But I want to come back again to this comparison here, this kind of side-by-side comparison with rendering to Caesar and rendering to God. This is, I think, the really important part of the message from this text. He begins by saying, give to Caesar what is his. It's a pretty clear concept in Jesus' mind. Let me see a coin. Let me see the coin you're talking about. Whose picture, whose inscription is on it? And he says, it's Caesar's. You got it from him in the first place. It's his. He can demand some of it back if he wants. We might not think that sounds fair. We might not like that. But in the eyes of Jesus, that's a pretty simple and straightforward concept. It's got his picture on it, so he gave it to us. How can you complain if he asks for some of it back? It's that simple. When it comes to rendering unto Caesar, and I mean that with quotation marks, and I mean kind of the modern equivalent of paying taxes, giving what is owed, paying taxes. There's a few observations I want to point out here. It shouldn't really bother us to pay. We might have mixed feelings about taxes. There's a part of me that thinks taxation is theft, and America did pretty good for its first 2/3 of its existence without an income tax or the IRS, but just because I feel that way doesn't mean I should be all upset and bent out of shape because I got to write a check to the United States Treasury every year. It shouldn't bother us. We might not like everything about it. We might be trying to change the tax codes or the tax laws or appointing representatives in the government who will change it the way we like. That's fine, but we shouldn't let this upset us. This shouldn't be something that we lose sleep over. Yeah, I don't like it, but at the end of the day, some of it's going to be wasted, but some of it's going to be spent on pretty important stuff. Schools, the ever important roads that, some people think maybe it's better in the private sector. Some people think maybe it's better if the government handles it. Again, those are matters of opinion, and you might feel one way or the other, but at the end of the day, paying for it pays for our military, it pays for our security, it pays for a lot of the infrastructure in this country. Yes, a lot of it is wasted. A lot of it, I think, is just spent on ridiculous projects that I don't want my money going to, but a lot of it is spent on stuff that I benefit from. It's kind of like the book of Ecclesiastes we just got done studying. The world works a certain way. Sometimes we think it should work differently. Sometimes we think things are unfair, but God says, okay, you can waste your whole life being upset about that, or you can just understand this is how it works and get on with your life and focus on more important things. It shouldn't bother us to pay our taxes. We don't get to choose how much we pay. It's not up to us, Maybe in America today, like I said, it's representative government. You might have lost some of your faith in whether or not you're truly represented in the government, but this is better than a monarchy where the king simply says, raise the taxes, and nobody can say, No, you have to do what the king says. When Caesar said, no, we're going to increase the taxes by 5%, no one could say no. You had to do that. Generally speaking, it's not up to us, We have a voice in it in America, but a lot of times I feel like I don't really control it. I wish taxes were lower, but they get higher every year, it seems like. Maybe sometimes they go down and up, but just over my lifetime, taxes have gotten higher and higher. I don't really get to choose that. So that's just the way it is. And a lot of times we don't have the best attitude about it either. Like I said, it shouldn't bother us, but our attitude speaks a lot about our feelings. I don't know, maybe you're totally different. Maybe you kind of round your numbers up when you're filing your tax return. So I'll just give a little something extra to the government. They did such a good job. I'll, tip 15% or something, just keep doing what you're doing. And no, I think most people, especially like business owners, people that usually end up owing rather than getting a return, let me know if this sounds familiar. There's always the temptation to try and hide away some of your income. A lot of celebrities get caught for that. They try to hide their income here and there in other bank accounts, and so they get taxed less because people want to pay as little as possible. There's legitimate ways too. You start to you don't necessarily want to start your retirement, but you start putting money in there because, well, they can't tax it if I put it in my retirement account. That way I'm taxed less, or, you designate income a certain way, or you try to get as many write-offs as possible. When you're paying taxes, what you're trying to do is pay as little as possible. I'm not saying that's wrong. It's your money. And if you go, especially if you go through legal means, write-offs, people are always looking for loopholes. I'm not saying tax evasion is okay. I'm just saying that in the proper channels, it's normal for you to want to pay as little as possible. And if you're like me, sometimes that means you put it off until April 14th, and then you file for an extension so you can put it off till October 14th. Because I just don't really want to right now. It's not something I enjoy doing, so I don't want to think about it. So I'm just going to get that extension and wait another, 5 or 6 months and deal with it later because I just don't like doing it. This is kind of the attitude a lot of people have to taxes. And so just a few observations I have. I want you to remember that. The three basic ideas there. It shouldn't bother us to pay, really. We shouldn't get upset about it. We don't get to choose how much we're taxed, and it's not always the most enjoyable thing. Those are observations about rendering to Caesar, but let's look at the other side of this coin. Yes, pun intended. Render to God. This is the more important statement. And render to God what belongs to God. And the comparison here is really quite simple. The picture on the coin was Caesar, so it belongs to him. Genesis chapter 1, we are created in the image of God. We belong to him. Give to him what belongs to him. That's the concept here. This is the parallel Jesus is trying to make. We give to Caesar what is already his. We give to God what is already his, and that's us. We belong to God. So why should we complain? Why should we be upset if God has expectations for our lives? We bear his image. We belong to him. It's only fair that he should ask something of us, that he should ask of us to follow him. And so, again, our first point is it shouldn't bother us. We shouldn't be upset that God has expectations. I know some people think, well, God loves me and that's it. Well, no, God wants you to do things. God, it's not just knowing that God loves you. It's, the Bible has commands in it. The Bible has directives in it. The Bible gives us guidance in how we should live our lives, and that's not just take it or leave it suggestion. And some people think, how could God ask things of me? You belong to him. It's really a simple concept. Just like the coins with Caesar's image belong to him, you belong to God. Romans talks about how we were helpless. We were against God. We were in our sins. We were caught in sin. We were, and he died for us. While we were hostile to God, while we were opposed to him, he died for us. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. This one came into my head after I did the PowerPoints and typed up my notes, but I think I like this one better than the text in Romans 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 14. For the love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all. There's your purchase price, by the way. One died for all, therefore all died. And he died for all, that they who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. It's a simple idea. Why should we complain about anything that God asks of us? Any sacrifice he asks of us to make? He says, we live for him now. He died for us. We should be grateful and give our entire lives to him in return. We should be happy about this. I mean, we know what happens when we die if we listen to God, if we're washed clean by the blood of Jesus. We know how beautiful, we're told how beautiful heaven is. How wonderful and amazing a reward that is. And time again, Jesus said, yes, that's worth it. That's worth any price you'll pay. So we should be glad. We should be glad. You know, we have mixed feelings about paying taxes to the government. Some of the money gets wasted, but, you know, we should just kind of cut the government a break. A lot of our money, a lot of our tax money does go to things that benefit us. Now think about rendering to God. We should be nothing but happy to give him anything he asks. Use our possessions as stewards, not owners, not living for ourselves anymore, as it says in 2 Corinthians 5. We look at our possessions as we're simply stewards and we use it for God's glory. We look at the things he's given us and we freely give them to Jesus and spend our life glorifying him. We don't elevate any relationship above him. We worry sometimes about our children, you know. What if I tell my daughter, you can't go out of the house dressed like that? She'll be upset with me. She won't like me. She'll say, I hate you. And so we just don't say anything. What we're doing is we're trying to maintain that relationship and ignoring God's voice. If you stand up, and your children might respect you. Yeah, maybe in the immediate moment, your teenage son or daughter might say, I hate you, but, you know, teenagers, their brain just kind of disappears for the teenage years. But if you stand firm for the word of God, I think in the long run, they'll respect you for it. We worry about saying things that will damage a friendship, so we just leave things unsaid. Again, that's elevating something above God, you know. Any relationship, anything God asks of us to lay on the altar before him, he bought and purchased our eternal soul, set us free, wants to bring us home with him for all eternity. How could you possibly begrudge giving him anything he asks, knowing what he's giving us, knowing the gift, the value of what he offers to us? We don't get to decide how much we pay. But, you know, here's kind of the quirk. Here's the thing I like the least about taxes, is that they make me do math. I hate math. You know, I heard someone recently compare this, and I thought this was a beautiful comparison. Imagine going to like a pizza restaurant, and they give you a bill, and it says, you got to add it up yourself. Here's the price of toppings per ounce, and you got to calculate how much pizza you ate, and maybe you can deduct the olives that fell off on the floor as they were delivering it to you, and so you got to have your deductions and add up the cost and do all this, and then the percentages, and then you come back and say, okay, here's what I think my pizza cost, and then they check your work, and that's how a tax return is. You say, hey, we're going to bill you, but you got to figure out your own bill, and if you're wrong, then we'll come and get you in trouble even more. I hate that. But it's kind of funny. That's kind of how it works with God. We don't get to decide how much we owe, but it's up to us to try and calculate that. In Luke chapter 12, we got the story about unfaithful and unwise servants. Luke chapter 12, I'm going to skip over the bulk of the story, but I just want to focus in on verse 47 here. The conclusion here, Luke chapter 12 and verse 47, the conclusion of this little parable. You know, are you found to be a faithful slave when your master returns? And verse 47, and that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will shall receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few. And from everyone who has been given much shall much be required. And to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. When it comes to our contribution, you know, Paul wrote to the Corinthians, as each has prospered. God says, you're going to have to do a little bit of estimation for yourself. Now, God's going to check our work at the end of the day, or at the end of our life, I should say. It's up to each one of us to figure, am I being fair? Knowing that Jesus laid down his life, and I'm supposed to do everything to his glory. Am I being stingy? Am I holding back what I owe him? If I prosper more, it's up to me to acknowledge that. I prosper more, but now I give less. I prosper more, so now I buy more things for me. I've been given much. I have a lot of abilities. I have a lot of knowledge in the Bible, but I'm not going to go out and share it. I'm not going to spend my time. I'm not going to give my time teaching others about the Bible. You see, that's where God says, I want you to do a little bit of calculating yourself and be honest about it. If you've prospered much, if you have been blessed with much, God says, well, that means I have high expectations of you. He has high expectations of everyone, blessed much or little. But I think the principle there is telling us, we got to do a little bit of this calculation ourselves and be honest. We know if we're cheating. We know if we're giving God less than we should. If we're holding back, just giving God the leftovers. That's the problem with a lot of so-called Christians. They've prospered much and they know it, but they're just going to give God the scraps. I'll give you as little as possible. And again, this comes back to our attitude. This is where the parallel breaks. I emphasized in our first point that it's our responsibility to submit to governing authorities, that Jesus said, pay your taxes, and things like that. But I'll be the first to admit, you don't have to love doing it. You don't have to enjoy doing it. You don't have to have a smile on your face as you're preparing your 1040. It's a bad word to me. But you got to do it. And you shouldn't be too bent out of shape about it. But I'm not saying you have to love it. But this is where the parallel breaks. In no way whatsoever should we treat rendering to God the same way that we treat rendering to Caesar, paying our taxes. When it comes to paying our taxes, we put it off as long as we can. I don't want to deal with it right now. When it comes to the things God asks of you, do you have that same attitude? It's not April 15th yet. I still got a lot of years left in my life. I don't want to deal with God's expectations yet. I don't want to do the things he's asked of me yet. When it comes to paying as little as possible, how much do I have to give, to be okay? How much time do I got to give? How many church functions do I got to go to? What's the minimum here to where I'm considered righteous? When we start thinking in terms of giving as little as possible, putting it off as long as we can, trying to hide away some of our income, trying to hide away some of our talents. Think of Matthew chapter 25 and verse 18. The 1 talent slave took that talent, buried it in the ground. And God demanded it of him and said, I expected a return from you. A lot of people are doing that the same way they would for taxes. Maybe if I just don't tell the government about this little side money I've got, I don't have to pay taxes on it. Maybe if I just kind of pretend like I don't have some of these abilities, talents, blessings that God has given me in this life, maybe, no, God's going to expect of you to use what you've been blessed with to go out and bring a return on that investment. There's no hiding it away. So this is where the parallel stops. We do not in any way treat paying our taxes like we do giving to God what we owe him. He wants everything. He wants every thought held captive to obedience to the gospel. He wants every action to be to his glory. He wants every relationship to be properly prioritized, not above him. He wants everything. We should be glad to do it. Have the weight of your sins washed away. I'm glad to pay anything he asks of me. In Matthew 22, the same chapter, he said, love your neighbor, love God with all your heart. This is what it's all about. We owe God our love. Matthew chapter 28, he said, go into all the world, making disciples. A disciple is supposed to be like their teacher. Luke 6 and verse 4, he said, a disciple is not above his teacher, but he wants to be trained to be just like his master or his teacher. says, go into all the world, make disciples. We owe him discipleship, to be like him, to pattern our lives like Jesus in every way, not just one day a week. Baptizing them, we owe him that. We want to be washed by his blood. That's how you do it. Teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. We owe him our obedience. Not just to some of the things he said, not just to the things we're agreeable with. We owe him our complete obedience to his commands. And it's based upon how much we've been blessed. We don't get to decide how much we pay, but he says, I expect you to figure. If you've been blessed, if you've prospered, more is expected of you. So I want to offer this as a convenient time. We're going to sing number 612 out of our books in just a moment. I don't like paying taxes, but I do it. I wish things were different, but it doesn't bother me. I don't lose sleep over it. But when it comes to giving to God what belongs to him, that's the most important thing you could ever try to calculate, try to measure, or try to put, value to. He wants everything. You should be glad to give it to him. If there's any way we can help you be closer to Jesus this morning, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing.